Good evening. This is the August edition of Operation City on the Hill. This is our second in the new series. The first edition we talked about two concepts, a new order for the ages versus a new world order. And both of these concepts came out of a new vision of human nature and how human beings needed to be treated. The old vision was basically that justice is the advantage of the stronger and might makes right. And this was used as justice. Warfare was a way of asserting one's will or establishing one's strength and dominance. And justice was whoever wins. This was used to justify both warfare and slavery. And the idea that one should strive for peace was at that time not considered rational. Warfare and slavery were natural parts of human striving, and we didn't consider them strange. Now, as we entered in, getting close to the modern age, we started to recognize there was different reasons why, and I went into it last time, so I'm not going to cover it again, but that human beings need to be accorded just treatment, and one of the criteria of justice is peace. You don't war on one another. So you had a new vision of human nature and the way we treat human beings. And so you had this, after years of tribal warfare and struggle and stuff like that, they were thinking, well, how are we going to have peace? How are we going to eliminate war? And one vision was put forward by, I think it was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And he wanted to have kind of like an international form of government where you have this parliament of nations and you would settle disputes politically. And James Madison thought it was a ridiculous idea, and dangerous actually, because you put political sovereignty into a global entity and with no entity above it. So he didn't think it was a very good idea, and he was saying that it wouldn't achieve the objective, and basically it would create a problem for sovereignty. He says now, but the idea of trying to achieve peace is a good idea, and we should try to achieve it. So, but in order to do that, we analyze what causes war. And he says the war are caused by two different types of phenomena. One is when the leaders go to war for a different reason. The other is the people themselves can't control their passions. He says, so the first cause of war, you can mitigate that by making the government accountable to the people, limiting the role of government, because if you centralize power, then you're going to attract people in it who are power seekers, and you're going to have corruption. Lord Acton once said that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So you limit the role of government, which is what the American Constitution was set up to do, and you make a government accountable to the people. And so that supposedly, and then you put fiscal limits on government and you make them pay for what they're going to do. That it's harder to go to war if you don't have a blank check, to spend on it. So that was one argument, and that was one category of war that was brought about by adventuresome leadership. The other is the public themselves, the passions of the people. And he says that one is a little bit harder to deal with. And he says you have to make the public accountable to right reason. And you don't necessarily do that through the government, because the government's accountable to the people. So how do you hold the people accountable? And that's when he moral transformation. And that essentially is a civil society, the moral cultural sector of society, which is a sector. Today, whenever we talk about society, we talk about government versus the private sector, and it's usually government versus business. And if you have big business, you need to rein them in, you use government. But back then, they had this vision of pluralistic order. You had a moral cultural sector of society, which religious organizations, voluntary associations. This would shape norms and characters and behavior that was necessary for a free people to come together. Because if a people are either held together by a common value system, which comes from the moral cultural sector, in the families and religious associations and voluntary associations where you voluntarily interact with one another, or you're going to be held together by regulation and force and then government. So the founders thought that they chose the former, that you have a strong and vital civil society, moral cultural sector, and you wouldn't need as much government. As a matter of fact, you wanted to limit the role of government. So in the early American founding, religion played an important role. Now, a lot of the founders were not sectarians. In other words, being sectarian religion, and we didn't have a national church like they did in Europe and stuff. So when I say religion played a role, it wasn't a direct role like you did in England, where you had the Church of England was the national government. But it was the underpinning of the moral cultural sector of society, where values were inculcated into the public that kept us together. And the Declaration of Independence refers to self-evident truths and refers to the laws of nature and nature's God that entitle us to a separate and equal station. That's one of the whole basis of their breaking away from England, was that they felt the laws of nature and nature's God entitled them to a separate and equal station, a government of their own. So basically, irrespective of a particular religious outlook, they believed in these universal, transcendent moral values: truth, beauty, goodness. Some of it came from the Judeo-Christian biblical tradition. Some of it came from the Greek philosophical tradition. And there was an idea that you wouldn't need a whole lot of government regulation if you had a common moral set of values based upon the dignity of the human person to hold the community together. And that, in the beginning, the big conflict that they struggled over was the issue of slavery, because it obviously violated, all men are created equal. And then by men, they were referring to mankind, and they were using the Genesis account that God created man in his own image, male and female had created them. So referring, the male and female of the species are both included. So the act of slavery was an affront to these values. And so you had the abolitionist movement that sprung up, started by the Quakers, but eventually you had other evangelicals, and they believed that slavery violated the covenant that they had entered into with God. And so they opposed it. And then you had various reasons, Jefferson and a bunch of others, they were opposed to it, not just here in the US, but globally, because they wanted to create a city on a hill, and that's where we got the name of this show, is the leadership that they expected to exert on the international stage was one of morality and ideas, and a vision that would allow them to operate as a city on a hill. And so that's why they sent the Declaration of Independence out to the world as a whole to declare the reasons for their separation. Now, one of the reasons why they wanted to do this is because they wanted to influence the world positively with these visions. They wanted to bring about this new order of the ages, not just here in America. They were doing an experiment in America, and they wanted people to follow. So their sense of leadership was, it wasn't so much military leadership. As a matter of fact, in the beginning, they didn't even think they needed to stand in an army during peacetime. That during the Barbary Pirates conflict, they changed their mind on that, but that's another story. But basically, the leadership that they wanted to, both here in America, to hold us together as a free society with limited government and limited regulation, was a common set of values. But they also wanted to lead the world with a common understanding of the dignity of the human person and the right to self-government, and a bunch of, the abolition of slavery was a big part of that. So you had these committees of correspondence with guys like Jefferson and Thomas Paine and a bunch of others were writing back and forth, and you had some French writers and English writers, and then you had this global abolitionist movement. And the Americans played a big part in this. They played a very large role, and they played an ideological leadership role, even though it was probably the British, in terms of naval enforcement of it, that had a bigger role in terms of the ideological push. But perhaps nowhere was this conflict more heated than right here in the U.S. itself, because although the Declaration of Independence had purported to represent America as a whole, there were some sections of the country that didn't buy into this. And they went for it anyway because they wanted to break away from England, but for different reasons. And so you had the there was a group in England, not in England, in the South, a group of aristocrats who did not believe in this whatsoever, and they were. I'm trying to think of the name for them, but it's irrelevant. Basically, they believed in a natural hierarchy, and they believed that slavery was a natural institution, and they held to the older values, and they were believed in the ancient. Now, a lot of our founders believed in some of the Greek philosophical ideas, but the Greek notion of natural slave. Some men are born to rule, and some men are born to be ruled. Aristotle said that. And some of these aristocrats down south believed that too, and they thought that slavery was a natural institution. And beyond slavery, even within the non-slave society is very highly stratified. And you have some hierarchical leadership, and and the idea that you would have this mobilization of upward mobility, and some people at the top, some people was able to, equal opportunity. They didn't believe in that, but they came together in the, originally they weren't part of the Revolutionary War was started by the people up in New England who were the Puritans, who saw this as like a continuation of what was referred to as a glorious revolution, where Cromwell and the Puritans in England broke away from the crown. And they saw this as a continuation of glorious revolution. And some of the aristocrats down south were the royalists, and they didn't believe in this. And it wasn't until the British started violating their home and their stuff like it in the war that they joined in too. So they joined in, but for different reasons, for home and tradition, and they finally joined in, and they didn't worry, they didn't argue about the Declaration. Who cares? It's just a piece of paper, and people are going to forget about this, and it's not going to mean anything. So I'm not going to argue about it. We don't agree with it, but as time went on, and the 18th century came into the 19th century, the abolitionist movement was growing more momentum than what they had anticipated it would. And you had a growing group you had the Quakers, you had the people like Jefferson and these deists, you had the Puritans, and you had among the most prominent leaders were escaped slaves, and one of the most prominent of these escaped slaves was Frederick Douglass. And so Frederick Douglass was a very articulate person, and he had that powerful baritone voice, and he was a very good speaker, and he was very effective in getting the message across. And then they started to realize that the Declaration of Independence, what they knew all along was opposed to their ideas, was gaining acceptance, and they didn't like that idea. And the Constitution that they thought that they would go, they recognized, contrary to what people believe, they recognized that the Northerners who had signed the Constitution had postponed the question of slavery, but hadn't forgot about it, because they intended to abolish it all along. And they knew that. Jefferson and others had said as much in some of their writings. And so the Southerners who thought that the time would be on their side, and that's why they compromised and went along with it, with the Constitution and the rights and all this, the right to self-government and all these things like that. And it didn't happen that way. Now, slavery wasn't there was a kind of like their Declaration of Independence. It was called Cornerstone, which is the cornerstone of a new republic, that they're going to break away and create their confederacy. Now, it wasn't just slavery, and I want to be clear on that, because, if you're a historian, you actually read Cornerstone. They're talking about a number of issues. Slavery is one of the issues, and they wanted to create a new republic under their own values. And they wrote this there was a document by the leaders of the breakaway Confederacy when they broke away from the Union. And slavery was one. Imposing tariffs. They believed in more freer trade. And they were an agricultural society, and they wanted to trade with the industrial societies of Europe, whereas the North American and the northern part of America was more industrialized, and they wanted protection against Europe's industrial products. So they were more protectionist, and they wanted shielding against the products that were being manufactured in Europe. So you had this difference of opinion as to whether or not we should have an open trading system, which the South wanted, and, or a protectionist system, which the North wanted. So they were complaining about the federal overreach, although they sometimes wanted to use federal overreach themselves when they wanted to enforce the fugitive slave law. But a really big issue, and some people try to downplay it nowadays, but a really big issue, and the reason for the separation, was the idea of we hold these truths, all men are created equal. They could not abide by that idea. So, as indicated by this, their objection, these ideas were gaining currency. And they were gaining currency overseas too. The slave trade was not completely, it was kind of abolished, but it was driven underground. Movements for national liberation took their inspiration from the Declaration of Independence. And you had these Muslim groups that wanted to break away from their former European colonists. And today, these Muslim groups see the U.S. as the great Satan, imperialist power. But at the time, they saw the U.S. as an example they wanted to follow as a former colony that broke away from their masters and declared their independence. So these groups that wanted to break away from freedom, they saw the example of the American Revolution, and we hold these truths to be self-evident, as something to aspire to. And so we had started to achieve, despite the hypocrisy of having slavery ourselves, we started to achieve a certain amount of moral leadership. And that particularly was the case after we ended slavery in our own society, and we abolished slavery. And as a celebration of that achievement and the role that America played in the larger abolitionist movement, the French give us the gift of the Statue of Liberty. Give us your poor, your tired, and your huddled masses yearning to be free. And this is throughout, there was most of the 19th century, first half of the 19th century, you had this ideology that was peace. The abolitionists were also peace people. Some of them didn't want to fight the war over slavery. They thought they could win without going to war, and they thought going to war would undermine their values, because not only did they want to end slavery, the slave system, they wanted to end the war system too. And they believed that they could win this over purely by moral and ideological leadership. And so that's an argument for another day. Would it have been possible to win over slavery if they would have stuck simply to a moral argument and we hadn't went to war? That's another question. After slavery, after the Civil War, you had differences of emphasis within the North came together, and it was a nice rallying cry for the Northern industrialists to get behind, because it captured the imagination of the public that, we're going to war for this noble cause. But after that, what caught their attention, and we won the war, so the immediacy of that cause lost some of its momentum. And at that time, a lot of the leaders in the North, industrial leaders, and then some of the coming up in the South too, they were concerned about catching up to England in Europe as an industrial power, progress. And so you had a movement, they refer to themselves as progressives, and they wanted to create progress. And so you had the agrarian age was a simple time. And this decentralized, limited self-government was for a simple people. We got this complicated time now, and a limited government is a dinosaur product of the agrarian age. If we want to progress and be progressive in the industrial age, we need to adopt the principles of scientific management of human society. And so you had progressives, you had another group called Taylorists, and they were roughly similar ideas. So the idea was that a society should be run by experts from the top down. You had a lot of them were graduates of Harvard Business School. And if they ran these big businesses and were successful, they should be able to run government too. And now they weren't necessarily directly running government, but sometimes there'd be advisors. So they'd be advisors, or they'd have positions on boards and stuff like that. And they thought that running the government was the same as running a large business. So you had the voluntary way of American society that Alexis de Tocqueville wrote about in his book, Democracy in America, where in the first part of America's existence throughout the first half of the 20th century, the 19th century, when you wanted to do something, you got together by voluntary association, often religious groups. Not necessarily churches, but people came together for religious reasons or just humanitarian reasons, and they created hospitals. There was a very ad hoc approach to getting things done. He noticed that whenever anything that needed to be done, in government, in France you'd have a territorial magnate, in England you'd have a bureaucrat. In America you'd have a voluntary association. People came together. You come together, you do it, and then you disperse. Then you come together and you create something else. So there was what is referred to as the voluntary way. And that was seen as inefficient by these they says, you need big government, big public school system, and big business. And this is, large institutions run by experts was the way that America was going to proceed in this new industrial age. And then as time went on, the progressives, instead of arguing that the society should be run by business leaders with business management, they became more social scientists. And instead of industrial progress, they were focusing on justice, because some of the industrial progress created injustice. But it still believed in a hierarchy and a big government. So you send these taxes, you have these regulators, and you create these programs, and the programs you have administrative bureaucracy. And you have a democratically elected officials who run the government. But whenever you have these programs, the programs are run by these unelected bureaucracies. So you have this thing called government by bureaucratic decree. Now, the funny thing happened as we move from the industrial age into the information age. We're starting to run into a situation that some people aren't recognizing it yet, but it's eerily parallel to the decentralized way of the agricultural age, but in a high-tech version. You got the sharing economy, where people, you use your car, someone calls you up, you can taxi them here and there instead of or someone bed and breakfast. They share assets, services, and stuff like that, and that's growing really rapidly. Now, some of them refer to it as a platform economy, because there's a software that creates a platform, but more and more the people are getting together directly. Now and increasingly these people are not taking a lifetime job with a large company. They're sharing resources and services, and so they might share they might use their car to taxi people around, and they get paid for that. They might use an extra home in their bedroom and rent it out like it was a hotel. Or they use, some of them are computer hacks. Instead of getting a full-time job constantly at a corporation, they're is a gig. Okay, I get some here, and they like it because it's freedom. So the modern information age is causing a lot of dislocation of the traditional jobs. But what it's also doing is, as you get X number of jobs you need to fill, that are being lost. You got X number of jobs over here that you need to fill that you can't fill because the people's qualifications for it, they don't have the proper training because there are new types of jobs. Artificial intelligence, on one hand, is replacing some jobs, but it's creating more as they're starting to realize that it's maybe more efficient to automate, but it's even more efficient than to augment, where you have people working together with robots. You're having electronic commerce, cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, stuff like that. That's getting harder to track. Harder to track, going to be harder to tax. You got in the automation field of artificial intelligence, which I think is a misnomer because we really don't know what human intelligence is. So to think we're going to create artificial intelligence is arrogant. But that's another story for another time. But places like China are trying to use this to control the population. But I don't think it's going to work because the data revolution is bringing all of this power to the average person. You got what is called 3D printing, which is going to also bring the power to produce stuff that usually was the preview of large manufacturers to the home business. So I think you're going to see a return to the kind of decentralized approach that characterized the America before the rise of the industrial age. And you have people now that are wondering how we're going to get people ready for this new economy. Well, there's something called hyper-learning, that you have online education, which is available all the time, which used to be how a lot of people education was not equated with schooling. Learning was a lifelong process. So I think the role of schooling, equating education and schooling, is going to go the way of the dodo bird. And we're going to return to it the way we did in the past, where education was a lifelong process, that you don't just go to school and now it's over with. And so I think that's gonna pick up. And the opportunity that is made available by a lot of this new technology is not necessarily going to leave people behind if we're ready for it. And people were wondering how we're going to regulate this. It's global. You're going to have a global regulation of it. It's probably not going to work. So my suggestion is that we're going to have to return to a society that is ordered by shared values. We have an information age. We have the ability to share values more rapidly and more universally than we ever did in the past, but we're not confident in them. Instead, we're looking for this global regulation. Frederick Douglass, the escaped slave, was predicted the eventual abolition of slavery, not just because of these ideas, but because of the spread of the ideas that were going to come about through global commerce. In his view of economics, the spread of economy in the marketing of economics was not separate from the marketing of ideas and family values, because the word economics in Greek, economy, means the science of household management. We've got to get back to that understanding where the economy and economics is part of the moral cultural sector, civil society. And with the economy, you can spread values and ideas. This is what Frederick Douglass recognizes and what the abolitionists realized. So an inculcation of our society in the values and ideas that were articulated in the Declaration of Independence, I believe, is just as relevant, if not more so, for the 21st century information age than it was for the 18th century agricultural age. And the new revolution now is going to be a revolution of information age prosperity, and we're going to have to transform our society in many different ways, and we're going to have to reverse some of the centralization processes that took place as we entered into the industrial age. And that is a process that will take a while, and it is probably not the easiest thing to go through, but it's something we're going to have to do if we're going to succeed in the information age.